Hello and welcome to the Car Care channel, and welcome to the 2023 Toyota Prius. All new for 2023, the 5th generation Prius. This is the car that started Toyota hybrids. So every generation that have come out since its inception in the first generation have been kind of the demo of what's to come in other lesser, not original hybrid models. But in this generation, they went a completely different direction. I mean, look at this. This is a beautiful looking car, but behind that beautiful body, there's one thing that I will say. They're hiding something very interesting, which we're going to talk about in this video right after this. Let's start our review, the technical review, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 5th generation hybrid system from Toyota. And if you look under the hood, it says Hybrid Reborn. That is a very nice marketing thing, but let's dig into the important thing, because in reality, once we get past all the excitement and the confetti, this is not exactly an all-new hybrid system. I feel like Toyota's been really busy with a single motor system that they're really making good stuff. You look at the Tundra, and now you're looking into stuff like the Grand Highlander and the Crown, and they have all this whole new hybrid system that they're busy with, that they did not design this from the ground up. I guess they went after, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But what they did do, and they did very well actually here, they updated their previous generation hybrid system with small, important updates that made it significantly better. And then some areas exactly the same, in very small areas not very good. Now the first thing is the engine have changed, and in this generation Prius you have two models. You have the regular hybrid and you have the Prime, which is a plug-in hybrid. Let's talk about the similar things between them, and we're kind of open up and go into both of them. The first thing is the engine. Long gone is the 2ZR engine, finally, because the 2ZR engine, while it was a good engine, it was ancient. It was too old for something this technologically advanced. So this new engine is a 2-liter M20A FXS. Hardly a new engine, if you ask me. It's been around in the Corolla for a few years here. It's been around in some other models throughout Toyota and Lexus lineup. But this is a much better engine, much more modern engine. And in my opinion, this might actually be a lot more reliable than the previous one. Let's talk about this engine briefly, because we have covered this engine so much on the channel. You're welcome to watch other videos, but let's talk about the highlight. This is a 2-liter 4-cylinder direct and port injected non-turbo EGR engine. It has an EGR system, and usually Prius owners with EGR, they will have some nightmares. That's unfortunately the case, but here things so far has been better, because this EGR system has been around for a while, for a few years now. There hasn't been issues. And then the D4S system, where you have direct and port at the same time, has been proven. It's been around for a long time, and it does not build carbon, and that's a good thing. The other thing is here, they did tweak this from the non-hybrid version, because there is a non-hybrid version of this engine. This is an Atkinson cycle only. This engine has a very clever VVTi system, variable valve timing. So the intake is electronic little motor. If the motor spins faster than the camshaft, it advances the timing. If it slows down, it retards the timing. If it spins at the same speed of the camshaft, it is base timing. Sounds like a disaster waiting to happen, but actually the system, it's a lot better than the oil one, if you ask me, from a technical standpoint, because there's not much to it. Okay, the motor goes out in 15, 20 years, you replace it and you keep going. There's no oil contamination and all this stuff. This is a much better system. Now on the exhaust side, we do have the oil system for the variable valve timing. Understandably so, usually the exhaust doesn't change angle as much. Now this engine, construction-wise, let's talk about it a little bit in case you haven't heard about it in our channel. Plastic valve cover. Very high quality plastic valve cover. So far there hasn't been issues, but it's still a plastic valve cover. Plastic intake, 2-piece cylinder head. So there's the top cradle that has the cam, and the bottom, which is the cylinder head that has the valves. All aluminum construction, very similar construction to other Toyota engines. However, this engine has few things, and they're not new, but let's cover them. The front timing cover is a 2-piece. They did that to eliminate the very infamous front timing cover leaks on many, many Toyota and Lexus models or engines. So The rear timing cover passes over the area where the cylinder head connects to the block. And that's usually where the point where the oil leaked. This doesn't have sealer in that area. It just has a cavity that is open, and then timing chain and all the components, and then the top cover in the front. This engine has two timing chains. One of them just drives the cams to the crank, very simple, and then the other one drives the oil pump. Speaking of the oil pump, this also has an electronically controlled variable oil pump. Oil change intervals are important. Using the right oil is important here, just like, for example, the A25A engine. Very similar build and similar family of engines as this one. This is a much better engine from every angle you look at it. It has more power, it's more refined. The way it delivers the power is better than the previous one. So that's what makes this car better. It is more peppy, it's not fast by any way, shape, or form, but it is better. It feels more like normal Corolla. It just up and goes and no fuss or drama. Let's talk about the transmission, because usually with hybrids, the transmission is a very important piece. So this still has an ECVT transmission, very similar operating principle, not to the previous generation, to the first hybrid. They never changed that operating principle. But they did do some updates here, and they actually gave it a new name, the transmission. So in the regular hybrid, you have the PB10 transmission, which in theory operates exactly the same, but they did a few tweaks. Stronger motors to give them a little bit more power, and that kind of contributes to why this car drives better. But the other thing that they changed is the lubrication and cooling system. So in the previous generations, you just used to have kind of a slush system. Just like a differential, you have oil sitting in the bottom, the gears kind of splash the oil. They did add a pump that kind of circulates some of that fluid. But here we have a dry sump system. And when I read that, that reminds you of supercars. You basically have a mechanical oil pump and an electric one and a little container on the side. So depends on the demand, oil can move to this little container, which is actually a catch can, and stay there in high demand. When things are moving faster, it'll drain that oil and start using it. But you won't have a lot of oil just sitting in the bottom of the transmission, because that creates drag. And that's why they're trying to do it this way. Now, on the Prime model, it is called the PB12. It is identical. The only difference between them is the motors in the Prime model are much bigger, much higher capacity. And the description for them is they are from a 2.5 liter engine. Very vague description in the technical data, but what that means is they're basically similar size motors to a Camry, a RAV4. So they're much bigger and stronger motors, because you're going to be driving in EV mode more, and they wanted that driving experience in EV mode to be more streamlined and better. So you're starting to see how they didn't really change a lot, but at the same time they did make tweaks to make things better. Now, there is one thing that was actually not a welcome change, at least for most people who are actually going to drive this and have it for a long time. The 12-volt battery in the 4th generation Prius finally moved from the back to under the hood. It was a very nice location. We were very happy with it. Well, they decided that was no longer the case, and the battery moved back in the trunk. It's not the end of the world, but it just creates kind of a havoc when the battery dies. But the big battery, the hybrid battery, or the high voltage battery, let's talk about the non-hybrid first. Here's what happened to that. So they got rid of the nickel metal hydride. There's no more nickel metal hydride in the Prius. It's still underneath the seat. It is a higher capacity battery. It's 222 nominal voltage, but it's a higher capacity battery that is smaller in size. That's the whole point of lithium ion. Still sits underneath the back seat, still has a air-cooled, it has a vent on the side with a filter, which you should actually keep very clean at all times and unobstructed. But the construction of the battery and the way it works remained very similar. Now in the Prime though, things are anything but similar to the previous generation. They really completely redone the whole thing with the battery. It's a bigger battery, it's a stronger battery, it is lithium ion just like a previous one, but they moved it from inside the car where it takes all your storage space to underneath the car, right underneath the seat, but on the outside. And what that means is we don't have air cooling anymore. Battery now is refrigerant cooled, so you have refrigerant lines running all the way to the back, to cool that battery and to heat that battery. They use electric heaters. It is not the most efficient, but we're not talking about an electric car here. This is a plug-in hybrid. You don't have problems with heat. You have a heat generator right here, the engine. So they kind of did some shuffling around, and in the end, this system now gets 40 miles of EV range. This is a lot better than the 25 that you used to get, and now this change puts the Prius Prime alongside the RAV4 Prime with the 40-mile range, which is very good. Now let's talk about the inverter with converter assembly. Normally, over kind of the updates of every generation of Priuses, the inverter kept getting smaller and smaller and more compact, and it takes less space. And when the 4th generation Prius came out, it was so small that they could actually fit the 12-volt battery. But in this car, that was kind of a surprise. It's exactly the same size. If anything, it's slightly bigger. And that was an interesting surprise because that's not been the norm. Internally, things are very similar. This is what does everything. It controls what the battery is doing, charges the battery, controls the AC compressor. If you have all-wheel drive in the non-prime models, this is what drives the rear motor, takes power from it, charges it. It does everything. So inside of here, there is something called a DC to DC converter. That's been always the case inside the inverter. But here they did a small tweak to make things better and actually makes the batteries smaller. So in the past, the order of turning on the car was as such. Same thing with all hybrids. The 12-volt battery powers up the inverter, then the inverter powers up the relays that turn on the hybrid battery, and then the DC to DC converter comes on and starts charging the battery. They made this change to eliminate the sudden rush of power, and the DC to DC converter is off. So here is how the operation of things changed. To eliminate a small component, actually a capacitor that used to be in the back, 3rd generation Prius were notorious for that capacitor to fail. They now use the 12-volt battery to power up the DC to DC converter, which it powers up the relays, and then when they come on, they don't power anything. It's already powered up. The DC to DC converter just switches from being operated by the 12-volt battery to being operated by the high voltage battery, and we continue. This might be a little bit more difficult to explain in simple terms, but they made a very effective positive change here for the DC to DC converter. Otherwise, things are exactly the same. That's just the way it is. That's why I'm telling you, this is not a real full 5th generation Prius. Now, in the non-prime model, you have all-wheel drive, but they did do something better. They made it better. The unit that sits in the back, the hybrid transaxle in the back, is the Q810. It's a bigger unit. It's a more powerful unit. So that means when you have the all-wheel drive model, you have better regeneration and better driving power, actually. And in the Prime, they do not have all-wheel drive, which makes sense. And other than these two differences between the Prime and the regular one, there is really, the system is very identical in the way it operates, except with two things. First, the Prime one has a charging port and an onboard charger. It's a 3.3 kilowatt charger. Works pretty good. I wish it was a little bigger than that so it would charge faster, but it's not the end of the world. And then the other thing that they did here, previously, the charger used to be underneath the seat in the previous generation. They had to move it because now we raised the sheet metal to put the battery on the outside. So this is where they could have done this slightly better. They moved the charger in the storage area, where in the previous generation you used to have the big behemoth battery that took all your storage space. Well, now you don't have the big behemoth battery, but you have the small behemoth charger that takes all your cargo space. They could have done that a little bit better, especially since a lot of people voiced their opinion over this. This could be done better, but they still will look at it when we do the exterior tour. We'll look at the back and how the storage space situation is. And the other thing that is completely different between the Prime and the non-Prime models is the mega complicated HVAC system. Remember, the Prime, even though we have the heat generator right here, but if we turn it on every time we need heat, it kind of becomes counterproductive. And this is what makes Toyota plug-in hybrids kind of at the top, because they really try not to use the engine when you're in EV mode. So this car, like the previous generation, Prius Prime, does have a heat pump system. And in order not to make this video super long, I do have two videos where we explain exactly how the system works. This works in a very similar fashion. Now, this is not an electric car, so they don't have the latest and the greatest tech here for that. But for this configuration of plug-in hybrid, this is actually a better one. The only difference between this and the previous generation Prius Prime is now you have additional refrigerant lines running all the way to the battery to cool it. So this system becomes very similar to that of the RAV4 Prime, which also has a refrigerant cooled battery. And the last thing on more of the technical DIY side. So for the longest time, Toyota Priuses or actually Toyota hybrids in their ECVT transmissions, they use Toyota WS fluid. Basically regular transmission fluid, that's the fluid they use. Except now we switched to the new fluid that they've been using in electric cars, namely the BZ4X and the Lexus RZ. It is called Toyota TE transaxle fluid. That's the fluid they decided to use. It is thinner oil because really you're not using it for hydraulics or anything. So they figured if we thin the oil, less friction, life is good, and that's what they want to do with these cars. Otherwise, and this is where we're going to draw the line on, this is not really a 5th generation hybrid system. Everything else is exactly the same. Service is exactly the same. You have two cooling systems. You have an engine with oil. You have a transmission with now new fancy oil. But service expectations and kind of reliability expectations, owning this car, if you've owned a previous generation Prius or you've owned a hybrid, are identical. There is nothing groundbreaking here. Some people will take that as a bad thing. Please don't get me wrong. They went a little heavy on advertising the 5th generation hybrid system, which is something very surprising because they've stopped at the 2nd generation Prius and they've never really mentioned it that this is a 3rd generation hybrid, 4th generation hybrid system, and now all of a sudden it's a 5th generation hybrid system when it is not really. The small updates they did, though, are very good. And this is where you know they didn't just put this engine and just get it out. They did this very well. And we're going to talk about this car more, and you'll see how they did things better here. Let's take a look underneath the 2023 Toyota Prius. First thing is, through the grille, there's actually the same shutters as they've used in previous generations, and in many hybrids, they shut off when it's really cold to prevent the radiators from overcooling the coolant. Then we walk underneath it, everything's covered up, but in a very familiar fashion. You see this little door, that's where your oil filter will be, and your drain plug, very simple with the new generation A engines. And then we look here at the suspension. Not a lot have changed. There are actually some interesting choices here, and I'm very proud of them. Steel lower control arm with a separate ball joint for the first time in a very long time for the Prius. Steel knuckle. This is a great idea. Whatever weight you're saving from the aluminum, you will pay for it later with the dissimilar metals from the bearing and the knuckle welding themselves together. And then because this is the Prime model, if you look at this axle, just look how beefy that axle is. It's because of that takeoff of semi-electric car when you're in EV mode, they needed to beef up that axle. That's a very big axle for a Prius, I have to say that. Then there is the lesser good stuff. If we come around and look here, you notice the lack of any covering here. I don't know why they love to do that, but there's nothing. If you look all the way up, there is a very small fender liner and the rest is just exposed. They love to do that, and that's, what are you gonna do? That's how car companies are going these days. Then we walk our way back to the exhaust. Something about Toyota exhaust, they're really high quality. Double wall, of course, they just make the right sounds. Insulation here, heat insulation is pretty good. This seems like the typical stuff they always use. It's not the best in the planet, but it is decent. And then you have the same braces as the 4th generation Prius. There's actually 2 of them. And then if you notice, this one is actually a brace as well. And then we walk our way back, and you notice things are kind of, the exhaust wraps around because this is where the battery is. And you notice this clip that is usually very difficult to undo on batteries. You have one right underneath the car because this is where the battery starts and it goes all the way to the back. Listen to this. That's a structural piece, and it is there to protect the battery. Now this is just a plastic little cover, but it's actually, if you look underneath it, it is the same, this strong steel covering this battery. Now the battery runs about, it's a huge battery here, not like electric cars, but again, this is a plug-in hybrid. As we walk our way around though, around past the battery, notice the fuel tank is actually hidden here. It actually wraps over the exhaust. If you come from this angle, you'll be able to see how it wraps over the exhaust right here. It's a pretty interesting touch right there. You notice fuel tank, heat shield, exhaust. They had to move it back because you have the huge battery here. Rear suspension, very typical TNGA stuff. Double wishbone, they like to call it double wishbone. I don't see the double wishbone, but separate coil spring, then the shock's in the back. Single piston caliper in the back with electronic parking brake. So finally the Prius gets rid of the cable operated parking brake with all the problems that it comes with. They've been having problems with them since they basically started putting disc brakes in the backs for the 3rd generation Prius. And muffler doesn't have tips that come out, even the XSE model, understandably so. This is a hybrid. But then there are some news that I'd like to share with you. Unfortunately, Toyota have joined the Germans in something. If you look at the wheel and you look at the lug nuts, well, we can't really call them that anymore because they are lug bolts now. They're actually 17 millimeter and they are bolts, no longer nuts. So every time you take these bolts, the wheel will just fall on you. I don't know what, there must be a reason for it that makes sense, but for now it does not make sense because this makes service a little bit more difficult and unnecessary. What was wrong with the studs? I don't know. But then there is one more thing to cheer you up in case you just realized that this is not the greatest idea. If you look right here at the very bottom, it says Prius. This is a very interesting touch. I feel like the team that designed these little hidden Easter eggs, and as we'll talk about the interior, I'll show you a few more, they were really going to town with them. And then something else about the wheel and tire, since we're talking about them. You look at this huge 19-inch wheel, pretty cool. But did you know that this is actually a tiny tire? 195 50/19. I mean, just look at this. This is a very, I hope it shows well on camera, this is a very small, thin tire. They do that, again, this is a Prius in the end, and they can't have a very wide tire, it'll kill the gas mileage. But I thought this was a pretty interesting size for this one. Let's take a look at the outside of the Prius, and the first thing we have to say, this is a properly good looking car. I mean, I never thought we'd live through a time where we say, that's a very good looking Prius. That's not what they're made for, but Toyota somehow managed to do it. This is a very good looking car, and not just a normal looking car, it's a very good looking one. And if you look at the front, the headlights are kind of, the first thing I notice is it's an inverted L. Almost, they're trying to tell you, we took our Lexus design team and we had them integrate something here. Headlights are actually very small. You have this big kind of wing in the front, and then the Toyota emblem here is not shiny silver. It's actually kind of a matte silver. And this section in the middle almost looks like the Corolla section, which this flat piece right here and the indentation, and it comes back out. Very interesting how they integrated all their design languages from other cars into one, and we have this design. Looks very, very good. Now there's something to be said about the Prius, this generation. It is very low. I mean, notice how low it is. And you start to see that when you come to the side, and you look at this quarter glass. Normally this was very tall. Here it's actually very small because the roof line is very low to the ground. Now before we move on, there is the flare arch right here that is black. I wish it was body color, that's objective. But then we look at the smaller details. There's this reflector here which tells me this design was not made for the US only. This was added on, this is regulations for the US. So other international models will not have these. As we walk around the side, this door is completely flat. Normal, nothing really of feature, and this is where less is more, except at the very bottom. I hope this shows well on camera, but if you notice there's this indentation, the body is pushed in and then it comes out. It gives us such a dramatic look. It's such a small touch, but it gives us a super dramatic look. Then we look at the doors, and there's something interesting in these doors. First, it's a low door, because this whole roof line is very low. But then if you look all the way at the bottom of the door, there's this guide. Very interesting guide, and it has an opening right here. All that does is just guides the door in to close. I thought that was pretty interesting. It's only in the front doors. Then when you talk about this situation, you notice the lack of a door handle here. Well, the door handle is here, and it is a button. So they really overcomplicated this door for design's sake. I mean, you could have put a manual handle here, would have been fine. So here's how this works. There's a door latch, but then there's another actuator here that releases the cable. So when you push this button, this motor releases the cable from the latch. But then in case battery is dead and you need to open the door, they put a manual release here, which you push. It's very difficult, and then the door opens. All this does is it pulls the latch immediately. But the interesting thing is, if the door is locked, you cannot really open it with this. So you need power to do that. If the car is closed, you have to reach in, and this was unnecessary. They could have done this with a manual door instead of this, but they chose the button. Over here is the fuel door, and I will open it from the inside, because remember, this is a Prius, so they do have the vapor recovery valve that needs to open. And same thing with other hybrids. You have 30 minutes to refuel. If you leave this door open for over 30 minutes, it'll actually shut off a valve inside, and now you cannot refuel. Then we go to the back, and this back also looks very nice. I mean, they really went over above with the design of this car. It looks nothing like any other Prius. Prius is largely written here. Then you have a very small Toyota logo right here. And it's just everything flows and it looks very nice. And then the bar tail light that runs across with a little detail that comes down. I really like how this car looks. And the Prime is not just written, it is actually in a font, which gives it a little bit of character, which is pretty cool. I mean, this car is really good looking, and they did a really good job. But let's look in the back hatch area, which starts with Prius written out right here. If you come see it, so they integrated the words Prius with the grid of the rear defroster. That was actually a lot of work to do this, and it's pretty cool. Then we open the back door, which in this particular model is a manual one. There's actually an option for a power one, which is interesting. Then we have this flimsy little thing, the tonneau cover, very flimsy, and it does come off. You just fold it and it comes off. And then it's kind of a flimsy fight to get it in there, but there we go. We got it. This is the Prime model, so the floor is higher because in the previous one we used to have the battery. Here you have to fight the covers. You see it's open, but the charger is underneath this foam piece, so at least they covered it up like that. And then right here is your 12-volt battery. So they gave you a really easy access door. It is similar size to the 4th generation Prius. It's not the smallest one like the previous ones, so that's better. This is a decent amount of space. It's still a hatchback, I think. And if you notice here, because this is an electronic button to open it, just like all Priuses, except the 1st generation, they give you this little access door. In case the battery is dead, you can actually open this door and manually open this door, this back hatch door, but you have to crawl in through the front. That's all Priuses that had a button, except the 1st generation, were like that. Folks, this is super impressive how this looks in person. And then there's more details. If you look here, so this has the optional glass roof. If you notice, the shark fin is actually integrated into this panel. It is not a detachable piece. Looks right, it is this right color. I really like that they paid attention to things like that. Then we look at the charge door, which a little bit on the flimsy side, but it's actually nicer than the RAV4 Prime, for example. not a fast DC charger. This is a plug-in hybrid. You have a little light here. And there's something interesting about the Prius Prime and the non-Prime. See, in previous times, the Prius Prime had a different look on the body. In this generation, though, they're identical. And that is the cool thing. Now, you don't have to buy a whole different looking car and the weird glass in the back. No, they're the same car. Yes, they're structurally underneath different because of the bigger battery and whatnot, but looks-wise, they're the same. Let's talk about the interior of the 2023 Toyota Prius. And I feel like they really did this one well. For the most part, it feels like a normal car interior. Usually Prius had an interesting, kind of on the odd side, and a little bit historically have been on the cheaper side. This, however, is a very nice place to be. But at the same time, that is a nice, a little bit on the futuristic side. It is easy to operate. This is something typical with Toyota. They don't want to make complicated cars that are very difficult to operate. Historically, seats with Priuses have been very comfortable, and this carries on the same thing. Interesting though, this is a higher trim. This is a Prius Prime XSE, although it's a pre-production prototype, but the driver's seat is power, the passenger seat is manual. Which they were both power, but that's what they went with. Now let's talk about some of the interior highlights. First thing is, the gauge is an all-screen gauge. We're going to talk a little bit about this a little bit later in the video because there's something interesting about it, unnecessary, and it is no longer in the center. It is more now right in front of the driver-ish. Talk about that in a bit. Infotainment system, been updated to the latest Toyota system. Very good system, can be sometimes glitchy, but it does have a lot of features and everybody seems to be happy with it, myself included. Big screen on the upper trims, which is nice. And then there is the little stuff. They wrote Prius in a very classy font right underneath it. It's this little stuff that do make a difference. Now the volume button is all the way on the passenger side. Does make sense because you do have your volume button right here and you can mute your audio from the steering wheel, but your passenger, if they put this button here, have to reach all the way over to do that, but now they can do that. It's right in front of them, so that does make sense. However, the infotainment system does not have any other buttons, just that one. Turn it on, turn it off, and volume, which I suppose makes sense. Now the shifter is the typical Prius shifter, but one thing about it, feels a little bit on the flimsy and cheaper side. This is again a pre-production prototype, so this might be better in the final production, but if it is not, this could be a little better. Around it, you have, this is a Prius Prime, so you have the auto HV mode, you have your hold, you have your park and brake. I like this center area. It's so compact and simple, yet you still have the very familiar shifter that we're used to. But right next to it is something pretty cool. This is your wireless charger, and you don't put your phone on top of it. You actually put your phone inside, and there's a little button that you physically press with your phone, and then it starts charging it. That is a good idea because right now my phone is there. It's all hidden. It's not in my way, covering something else. And then as you move forward past the round objects that we don't talk about on the channel, you have a little compartment here. But then the slight silliness starts, because when you pull this, there's a hidden compartment with a hashtag hidden compartment. And this hashtag stuff goes all over the place. In the wireless charger, hashtag charger or wireless charger something. Center console has that, and they're kind of spread all around. If they wouldn't have put that, it would have made any difference at all. But that's what somebody in the design team decided to do. Moving on. This is the climate controls, and they are very simple. There's a small screen in the middle that shows you temperature and mode, whatnot, but everything else is physical button, including your heated seats and cooled seats. This particular one does not have cooled seats. Now, this car also have a multi-orientation of roofs. You can have the solar panels, which is something that has been kind of lost with the Prius, and now it's back. Doesn't really make a lot of difference unless you live in a really hot, sunny area like California, for example, or the south of the United States. But in our area, that's not an option that's very popular. But then you have the double glass sunroof, like in this particular one. It's nice, but it doesn't open. So that's, again, here where you have to make a decision what exactly your priorities are. The only concern about this one is when it's closed, this piece of fake vinyl just doesn't feel very nice. I guess they had to do it like that to put the two glasses and put the roller in the middle that retracts it, but that's one thing they did. But let's turn this review back to the technical side, because this car has Toyota Safety Sense 3.0. Kind of on overdrive though, not the normal stuff. So this has one radar sensor in the front that is a super wide angle one. Same thing with the camera on the glass. So what they're trying to achieve here is it can detect so much wider that when there's a car coming from the side, it can detect it. So if you're at an intersection, you're about to go and there's a car coming, it'll detect that and it'll actually alert you, then hit the brakes as needed. But it goes so much more than that. And this is where the system is actually up there in how featureful it is. It has accident avoidance, not only just braking, it can actually maneuver the steering wheel to get you out of harm's way. If it sees a pedestrian you're about to hit, it'll actually maneuver out, and this is something new. They've never really done that. Usually it was only brake, but now it's brake, accident avoidance, and steering. So it is pretty cool. Does work okay. Sometimes it is annoying and overactive. It beeps at you all the time. But then there's something they took from Lexus. It was kind of a surprise to see it here. The driver monitor. Right on top of the steering wheel, you have a little infrared camera that's scanning your face. If you're not paying attention, it's going to start to alert you. But it is great on paper, but in the real world, it can be annoying. And here's why. So you're driving and you put your hand here, slightly just blocking that infrared sensor. It'll immediately tell you, driver face not detected, sit up. Constantly beeping at you for something or another. Can get annoying, and it's kind of a surprise to see it in a car at this kind of lower end of things. Usually this is a Lexus feature, but here it is in the 2023 Prius. Let's talk about the back seat of the 2023 Prius. I am 5'7", this is my driving position. I have actually a lot of knee room here, which is good. But what is something interesting about this, and this I suppose is the norm with smaller cars like this. When you sit up straight, there's a lot of space between your knee and the seat, which makes it not the most comfortable seat in the planet for long-term trips, for example. But for what the size of this car is, this is a pretty impressive rear seat, a lot of room, very comfortable place to be other than the knee thing. You do even have two USB-Cs here and a household style power outlet, which is nice. You don't expect a lot of amenities in a car in this segment, but the rear seat, not bad. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the 2023 Toyota Prius, and in all honesty, there's very few. This was really done well. The first thing is the gauge situation. As far as I recall, initially, people who owned the Prius, they didn't like the center gauge, but over the years, people got used to them and became kind of a Prius thing. They changed it to in front of the steering wheel, but I wish they would have just went like Corolla style. Would have worked perfectly fine. Instead, you have a gauge that is partially covered by the steering wheel, kind of like the BZ4X. They actually took that and put it here. It doesn't make sense. It's a very small screen, which is, I guess it works for this model, but it's way too low. And no matter how you sit, you're always blocking part of it, which is not a good idea. The other thing is, and this might just be me, I kind of hoped they would have made a whole new hybrid system for this, kind of showcasing the future, but I suppose Toyota's been really busy with the single motor system and they're making their hybrid max and all, kind of heading in a different direction with hybrids. So they did the updates here. They're not really a whole new 5th generation. That is, I feel like a marketing thing because the engine is not new. The inverter actually is exactly the same size. And more importantly, for average Joe buying the car, gas mileage remained the same, and in some cases actually dropped a little bit. So that's the one thing. However, that should not be mistaken by the Prime model, because the Prime model did get a huge update, did get a lot better EV range, which is very good. So should you buy a 2023 Toyota Prius? Folks, this was kind of a surprise, this car. First, the way it looks. I mean, this thing looks really good. It not only looks like okay or better. It looks very good, even in the eyes of car people. This is a good looking car. And the thing is, the update, it was not a complete overhaul update. This engine, for example, is not a new engine. It's not specific engine to this car. It's been out for a few years, but it is a much better engine than the previous one. And then the small updates that they did here and there, they were done very well, and they really addressed the issues of the previous generations, which makes this entire package a very good one, in my opinion. Yes, the gauges are not ideal. Yes, there are a few odds and ends that are not ideal, but overall as a car, this is a really good car. One of the biggest complaints about the previous generation Prius is the way it looks. It was too focused on that shape that needs to be aerodynamic, so the car would get that good gas mileage, that it didn't appeal to many people. But now, I mean, this is not only a normal looking car, this is a good looking car which has a lot of tech, safety tech, a lot of features. Some of the safety tech can get annoying and a little bit too much, but that's the direction we're going with cars. I think the majority of the updates, and really the huge updates, happened to the plug-in hybrid model, the Prime. 40 miles of range for this one is a lot better, and now it's a match to the RAV4 Prime. So if you don't need an SUV in a big car, you can have this. Still has the hatch, still have everything. Some of the options though are interesting, which only drive the price of this car up, which is something I'd like you to scan carefully, because some of the options really are useless. There's no other way to say it. Sorry, Toyota. Folks, I hope this video is helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.